Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today you join us at Mr VANOS, who is a BMW M car specialist, especially with rebuilding VANOS units and M engines. We've been running his upgraded engine in our F90 M5 for the last 6 months, as has he, and he's been putting down some really impressive times. So we're here today to take a closer look. So I'm here with Steve now from Mr VANOS, and he's going to give you a brief overview of who he is and how he's ended up making this product for the S63 engines. If you guys know, we've been tuning these cars since the F10 M5 and the F90 M5. The issue you have is that the turbos are much more capable than the engine is, so you can actually push the turbos so hard that you bend a rod. So this was one of the reasons why you've made this product.
Yeah, basically. So yeah, we are Mr VANOS. I'm Mr VANOS, as everyone knows me as Mr VANOS. I rarely get called my usual name anymore. Yeah, so we've been doing VANOS units and engine building since 2008. The last sort of 2 years, 18 months, there has been things we've seen with the rods in particular on this car. F10s to a point, but they can't generate as much power as an F90 can because of gearbox and other issues. So more and more people are pushing these beyond the limit of a standard rod, and the bending. And when that bends, it basically causes a lot of damage.
Yeah, so with the F10, the weak point is the clutches. They'll tend to go before the rods, if people are wondering why it's less of an issue on those. Yeah.
The fact it's automatic on the new one and four-wheel drive, there's so much more grip, there's so much more load can go through an automatic gearbox. And basically, the weakest point is then found after that, which it turns out is the rod. It's not that the rod is bad from the factory, the rods are brilliant up to a point. And
yeah, so for a standard car, we were discussing this earlier, it's absolutely fine. That engine is really reliable. It's when you start pushing it much further than it's meant to go that you start seeing an issue. Yeah,
the standard engine is brilliant. As long as you service it regularly and look after it, there's no reason why they won't do 100,000 miles, and there are 100,000 mile F90s out there.
Yeah, really, and it's a rare situation where the stock turbo is capable of so much that usually you would get to the limit of the turbo first before the limit of the engine, but on the F90 it's the first time we've seen it's the other way around, and people get really happy when they're tuning them and keep putting the boost up, and then before you know it, you're in trouble. Yeah.
So we kind of looked at it, thought, what's the best way to do this? There's obviously aftermarket rods and pistons out there, but they require a full engine strip down, top to bottom, crank out, and then they need balancing. And there's balancing is such a fine art, and with a V8 you can't ever truly balance them. It's always a compromise. So we kind of thought, well, what's the best way of doing it rather than going through that route? If we can come up with an idea where you can get a rod which is a drop-in rod, essentially meaning no balancing, eliminates the weak point. You can use a standard pistons, because as far as I'm aware there's been no standard piston failures, other than rods coming out the block and then the pistons following, which I think is a bit of misleading. So we thought, right, well, how can we do this where it's a simple solution without reinventing the whole engine, which is really good. And trying to keep costs down as well, because there's kind of people don't want to chuck 20-30 grand at a car.
Yeah, well, the thing is, if you keep the stuff simple, it usually works out better. So you want to find the weak point and eliminate that weak point rather than changing everything around it, because you just make things complicated and it's as expensive, as you said.
Yeah, keeping it simple is the way forward. So looked at a few manufacturers. Arrow's lucky that we're in this country. Regarded by many as probably one of the best rod manufacturers in the world. Approached them and said, this is what I want to do, and they kind of said, well, I don't think that's possible. Trying to get it as a drop-in rod where the balancing weight's right and it truly works where there's no balancing to do. So it took a long time, but backwards and forwards, how we wanted it, where we wanted it, and trying to get the combination of what we think needs to be strength with the rods, what sort of limits you want, because that also helps. If you can set a limit to what you want to work to, it helps with the balancing, because they can work with a certain weight of rod. So it turns out these rods are a lot heavier than stock, but the weight's being moved around. So the rods are slightly heavier at one end than the other, and by moving weight around from one end to the other, you end up with a rod, when you balance it on a machine and you do all the calculations, it actually balances perfectly. So after all the work, there was a little bit of, not guessing, but it was kind of, a lot of calculation went to that point, but until you spin one up on a machine and truly balance one and see what it is, you don't know if it's going to be close, whether it's better or worse. It turns out that everything's worked, that the balancing of the engine is actually better than standard from the factory. So
yeah, and to be honest, so I've been running this setup in my car, and you've been running it in your car for quite a while, and it's really smooth.
Yeah, silky smooth.
It is very, very smooth.
Yeah, and the smoother the engine is, the more power it can generate, because it's not, there's no knock detector or anything like that, or vibrations, and basically it'll last longer. The smoother it is, the less stress there is on the bearings and every other component, and it just basically means it lasts longer. So if the car would do 100,000 miles standard, our plan is it should do that same again with these rods in.
Now that we've discussed the background of why this product has been created, let's talk about what you've ended up with after 2 years of development.
Yeah, so here we have 3 rods. So we have ours, we've got an F90 rod, and we have an F10 rod. The F90 rod and the F10 is essentially the same strength, same design. The differences are in the end. F10 rod uses a beryllium end with a bush inside. F90 and all BMWs pretty much since a Rolls-Royce in 2011, they've started using a drilled hole and then putting a diamond-like coated piston pin in, which is really hard and can run without a bush. It is a cost-saving exercise, so one isn't better than the other. It's just a manufacturing point that it is cheaper to make that than it is to make that one. So the reason we've gone with that is purely from Arrow, they use a beryllium end. They don't like using this formed end because that's not what they do. They know this end works, they know it lasts. They don't want to change the formula too much. So, but the good thing about that is it means this rod will work in an F10, it'll work in an F90 without changing pistons. And that's basically that. So.
This is what happens to a standard rod when you run too much power and boost through it. But let's talk about pistons, Steve. What pistons are you pairing up with this upgrade?
With the F90 we're running standard pistons. And the reason being is we looked at them and we found out who they're made by, and we know they're made by Mile Motorsport. Mile Motorsport make pistons for pretty much everything out there, and regarded by, again, as the best pistons you can buy. Really, really good. They're not forged, and realistically, for the power that we're running and what people are wanting to get from an F90, there's no reason to forge them and create another headache with balancing and potential issues with wearing out and stuff like that. People have this belief that a forged piston is actually better than a cast one, and it isn't strictly true. A forging is more detonation resistance, but the whole point of tuning the car properly and logging it is to make sure it doesn't have any dent or knocking. If you haven't got any, then realistically there's no reason for it to fail. So, and a forged piston will fail exactly the same way if it's got detonation problems.
That is also what you use as an upgrade in the F10 M5 S63.
Yeah, so in an F10 they're a Mile Motorsport piston, but the F90, because of the higher fuel pressure, slightly higher cylinder pressures, and the fact it's a more capable engine, they're a slightly heavier piston, a slightly stronger piston. There's a bit more weight under the crown, which means it's a bit stronger, and the shape of it is ever so slightly different on the top. I mean, you can't really see it, but there is a difference in the crown. It just disperses the injection better, and it's better for higher cylinder pressure. So on an F10, if you put a methanol injection, you've got more going in there. It just means it's swirling around better, and it just means the engine runs better. So it's a good upgrade. We use these rods with the F90 pistons and F10s, and there's quite a few out there at the minute we've built that are running sort of 1,000 horsepower. So.
Okay, and when it comes to longevity, this is again exactly the same setup that you have in your car, I have in my car currently, and you've done maybe 120, 150 quarter-mile launches.
At least, yeah.
At least, and your car on the stock turbos, which we'll talk about later on, is running a 9.7 quarter-mile on the stock turbos, which is amazing.
Repeatable as well. It's doing it time after time after time. Santa Pod a couple of weeks ago, we did 20 runs, quarter mile, time after time. On the way home, it did ridiculous times on the road again. We went to Elvington and it did 40 runs, half mile and quarter mile. So it just keeps churning them out and churning them out. And the good thing about the standard piston is designed to run in the standard block and run and not fail or wear out. It's got coatings on that's there to last for at least 100,000 miles, what BMW wanted. So why change something that you know is going to work and put something there that requires more work just to get it back to the point it was before you started?
Yeah, so this comes back to the whole point of keeping it simple and not changing things that you don't need to change and creating more headaches everywhere else. So now we've covered the pistons. Another question that we get asked, and you probably get asked on this particular build that you're doing, is why don't you change the main bearings? So do you want to tell us?
The main bearings from BMW are graded to the block. So there's codes on the back of the block, there's codes on the crankshaft, and those codes correspond to a table that BMW have, and you basically grade the bearings. And it's BMW are very specific about why they do it. It's to do with clearances. And I just think, why change from something that's really quite specific and put something aftermarket in there, which it loses all that grading. They basically put a bearing in, and they're quite good, but they're not when you're pushing big power, you might as well do everything as good as you can.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you get the clearances right on the crank, you're starting from a good baseline, which we know that on a standard car will run at least 100,000 miles without issues. And the main bearings aren't the problem on this car. So it is literally the rod bearings and the rods themselves that are the weak point. So,
Steve, you mentioned that this is a drop-in product. So can you explain the process? If I come to you with a running car, what is the process? How long does it take?
Yeah, so the whole point of doing this was a drop-in process, which basically means that we can take what you see here. We can take a running car as long as there's no noises, no metal in the oil, no misfire, anything like that. Remove these pistons and drop this in. So it will be engine out, remove the cylinder heads, remove the sump, put everything through a wash, reface the heads, install this into the block, rebuild the engine and put it back in the car. Realistically, if it's that process, we aim to do it in a week.
Okay.
So from start to finish.
And what happens if someone's pushed their car too hard and they've now got a problem and they've bent a rod? What's the best case scenario, worst case scenario?
Best case scenario, the rod's bent. We see quite a few where the underside of the piston's actually hitting the crankshaft and it makes a tapping noise, and people think it's a rod bearing failure, but it isn't. It's just that part of the piston hitting the crank web. Best case is that it's bent the rod, there's no damage to the cylinder. It is still a drop-in process, and that can be done in a week or so. So that's the best case. The worst case scenario is
this one.
This one
this
here.
is from the rod that we were looking at earlier. So what's happened to this one?
This is bent that badly that it's dragged the edge of the piston down the cylinder wall. It's dragged it down this side. That contact with the aluminium soft, has basically taken a chunk out of the aluminium cylinder, and that has just left it beyond repair. You know, there's only a certain oversized piston that BMW do, which is 0.2 of a mil. This probably had 3/4 of a millimeter at least missing before you even start to oversize the cylinder.
So how's this block been repaired?
This has been repaired using iron liners, which is, it's quite a job to do properly. It's a bit of a process. In terms of what this block is now, it's actually really strong. It's better than it was before, and it's more resistant to any kind of wear in the cylinder. This, now with it being linered, what we are using is the LCI M5 pistons and the M8 pistons, which are designed for an iron liner, because the new BMW blocks have got a spray coated iron on them. So they're kind of running this, but it's not as thick. It's only about 1 millimeter thick. This is now a really strong block. The downside of this is, number one, the cost. It negates.
It goes up a lot.
Huge amount of money. You know, this has probably put another £6,000 or £7,000 on the job, which is, this has been here for a long time.
Yeah, and that's partly because of the supply chain issues that whole automotive world has been seeing. So this customer's now been without his car for about 8-9 months, maybe, I don't know.
I think it was here in October originally, and it should have been in for a week. And pistons weren't available from BMW. There was back order parts, there was back order this, and we lost 4.5 to 5 months just on supply chain issues alone. So, but that is part of what this problem has created, just by trying to chase
draggy times.
Yeah,
and unfortunately draggy is a very good way of measuring where you're at, but it's also a curse at the same time, because not every car is going to react in the same way. And we look at data logs sometimes, we say to customers that's the most we're comfortable to push the car. They end up going somewhere else who's comfortable pushing it further, and then you end up with an issue like this.
And it is just looking for that little bit extra sometimes, and it's not worth
0.5.
it. Yeah,
1.5 on my 100 to 200, and that's what
it's just not worth it. And the amount of work that goes into getting a car quick, and the amount of time it takes to log everything, you just know where it's safe, don't you? You know where to push it. And there is a bit of a thing where the competitions are a little bit at launching and a bit better at driving, and the draggy times are better with a competition car. So that helps when you've got a non-comp and people just see the times on draggy and think, well, I can do that. And they don't realise how much effort's gone into it.
So cool, we've looked at the product, we looked at the best case scenario, worst case scenario when it comes to the fitting, so let's get this assembled.
Yeah, we'll get Dave, our engine builder, in. He'll come in and start installing the crankshaft first of all, and then we'll drop the rods and pistons.
Cool. So Steve, the rotating assembly has now been done, but what people are going to be interested in is, what does this allow us to do on the car? Your car's running stock turbos at the moment, so I just want you to go through some of the times you've been achieving.
Yeah, everyone's interested in draggy these days. It seems to be the go-to benchmark rather than dynoing anymore. So currently with this exact setup in our car, nothing different. Done 9.71 quarter mile, 143 miles an hour. It's done a 15.4 half mile, 173. We've done a 2.33 0 to 60, which is phenomenal. I know, it's unbelievable. Yeah, it's currently got the fastest BMW 1 mile time on draggy of any car in history. So it's at its limit of a standard turbo now, but the car performs religiously though.
It's very consistent.
Yeah, it's not done it once. We've got literally...
We'll just put up on the screen like how consistent it is. It's not just one-offs, this is consistently doing these times.
Yeah, we've got hundreds of runs on here. You know, there's over 250 quarter mile runs at a sub 10 seconds.
Yeah, so we'll just go through the hardware your car has at the moment. Obviously has this engine specification, it has stock turbos, it has methanol kit, has downpipes, has even Chewy intake, CSF charge coolers, and Evolve custom tune.
Yes.
And XHP gearbox software.
And we have the prototype inlets for the
Venturi as well,
which are coming,
which are coming soon.
Yeah.
So we are now at the limit of the stock turbo with all the bolt-ons on there. So the next step is to go for some hybrid turbos. So my car is going for one set of hybrid turbos, Steve's going for another one, so we can see the difference between them, and we will share the results of those in the next month or so when we get both cars dialed in on those turbos. So in terms of engine from here, how long are we talking about to get to a fully built engine and back in the car?
Realistically, from this point, it's time and cover on, cylinder heads on, sump on, oil pump, and then all the ancillaries, and the ancillaries take as much time as anything. So inlet manifolds, a lot of wiring loom, turbos and stuff like that. But realistically, a day and a half, that will be ready to put back in the car.
Cool. And the next time I'm going to be coming up here, hopefully, is with the M4 G82. So we're going to do our stage 1, stage 2 tuning on that. Then we're going to essentially do the same process on that, build that engine and try and get it to 1,000 horsepower. So I'm looking forward to working on that project.
Yeah, I can't wait for that one actually. Yeah.
Cool. So that's it for now, guys. If you've got any questions, drop them in the comments below and we'll do our best to answer them for you. Thank you so much for watching, guys. If you liked the video, please remember to smash that like button. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel. If you want to join the conversation, please drop a comment below and we'll try our best to respond to you. If you want to watch more of this project, you can do so over here. If you want to watch what YouTube thinks you might like from our other content, you can do so over here.